Okay, this is a quick lecture on what is poetry. This is something I normally give to my face-to-face classes, and I will be commenting on some of the ideas in here as you progress. Now, a lot of these concepts you'll already be familiar with because you've been doing the reading and been thinking about poetry now for a couple weeks, and I wanted to wait until you've been thinking about it and been assigned a poem before giving this information to you so that maybe you would have came to some of these conclusions on your own. But this is meant to help you further along in your understanding of what poetry is. So some suggestions before you begin this lesson. Be sure you've done all the reading, you've completed all the assigned quizzes, and that you've been participating in the discussion assignments on D2L, as those will also help you understand some of these concepts. My goals for this lesson is I want to welcome you into an ongoing conversation about what poetry is and can be, explore some of the traditional constraints poets and literary critics have placed on poetry in order to differentiate it from prose, and review some of these concepts. Now, we're not in the 12th edition, we're in the actual 13th edition, so this slideshow is based on an older version of the textbook, so some of the page numbers might be a little off. So always refer to your table of contents. You might want to keep track of the poems that I discuss in here so that you can find them in the table of contents. I do discuss some poems that don't appear in your textbook, and when those come up, I will of course explain that they are not in the textbook. So I want to also encourage you to challenge, contradict, and argue against any of the ideas these poets and critics present that limit poetry. Okay. So, one of the most challenging things for students is to approach poetry on its own terms. Really, to be a good reader of poetry, of a poem, is to approach poetry as the art of language. This is a concept I'm borrowing from the critic right here, Louis Turco. He came up with this definition. He calls poetry the art of language and differentiates it from fiction, which he calls the art of written narrative. So the key concept here is not meaning. When we're approaching poetry, we're not as concerned with meaning, we're not as concerned with value, although value is inherent in most poetry that is published. We're concerned with language, how the language is working, how it's put together to create a specific effect. So in poetry, there's a lot more variables than in fiction or in nonfiction, where, you know, like your essays, primary goal is to present an idea, an argument, and show support or evidence for that idea of argument. Reports' primary goal is to provide information. A novel is a written narrative that's discussing a certain plot. Poems sometimes have plot and sometimes don't. Sometimes they're nothing more than a jumble of words, and it's how the words are put together that really creates an effect, and that's what we look at with poetry. We don't look at, I mean, we can look at those other things, but they're not nearly as important as the language itself. So that's one of the reasons your paper is approaching it from what's called a structuralist standpoint. You're looking at how the poem is put together. So this is a good example of what I'm talking about. This right here is a Cummings poem, E. E. Cummings. Some of you may be familiar with him. And we can apply this definition, the art of language, to this poem. Looking at it, this is a nonsensical poem. We really, at first glance, have trouble figuring out what's going on here. It looks like a bunch of random letters all over the field of the page. That's what we call this, the field of the page. But actually, if you start to look at it based on its title, Grasshopper, you can read it, and it reads, Grasshopper, who as we look up now, gathering into a leap, arriving to rearrangingly become grasshopper. And then you start to think about it. Well, isn't this what a grasshopper does? Is a grasshopper not defined by its leap? And this is what the letters and the language are doing here. They're leaping, they're jumping off the page, they're disordered, and it doesn't fully become grasshopper until it goes through this process. So this is E. E. Cummings taking language and making it apply to the real world in a sense. In a sense, this is more meaningful than the syntactical unit we have here, grasshopper, who as we look up now gathering into the leap arrives to rearrangingly become grasshopper. This is more meaningful because it's language doing physically what a grasshopper does, and that defines it as it is. So in a lot of ways, this is how we think about this type of poetry called concrete poetry or conceptual poetry. It's just one way that Turco's definition becomes apparent. Dickinson, Emily Dickinson is a famous poet, big name poet, but she actually didn't become famous until long after her death. Really in the late 19th century, early 20th century is when we finally started recognizing her greatness. And what she does with her language is she creates meaning through lineation, through capitalization, through the use of something called the em dash. That's this long dash here. And you can see this, and she also matches it to the meters of church hymns to ironically call to question religiosity and psalmistry in a time period when she was alive, when religion was paramount. It was everything. So if you look at her poetry, much madness is divinest sense to a discerning eye, much sense the starkest madness, 'tis the majority in this, as all prevail, assent and you are sane, demure, you're straightway dangerous and handled with a chain. You know, we can look at this and we can see the rhymes, we can see the rhythm, we can see the lineation. That's how the lines are broken. We can look at the em dashes, we can look at the words that are capitalized, and from that we can come up with different possibilities for what is important in this poem. So lineation, the way a line breaks, is a very important concept to understand with poetry. This poem is probably a little more straightforward and a little easier to grasp. It's Traveling Through the Dark by William Stafford. It actually does appear in your assigned reading. Traveling through the dark, I found a deer, dead on the edge of the Wilson River Road. It is usually best to roll them into the canyon. That road is narrow. To swerve might make more dead. By glow of the tail light, I stumbled back of the car and stood by the heap. A doe, a recent killing. She had stiffened already, almost cold. I dragged her off. She was large in the belly. My fingers touching her side brought me the reason. Her side was warm. Her fawn lay there waiting, alive, still, never to be born. Beside that mountain road I hesitated. The car aimed ahead, its lowered parking lights under the hood purred the steady engine. I stood in the glare of the warm exhaust turning red. Around our group I could hear the wilderness listen. I thought hard for us all, my only swerving, then pushed her over the edge into the river. So this poem you can actually scan, and you can look at its stresses and its slacks to see what's important. This poem is actually what's called unrhymed iambic pentameter, or blank verse. So each syllable, the majority of the syllables in this, are a slack stress construction. And we'll talk more about what that means in a future lesson. Much of the English language is written in blank verse. So it's a pretty good bet if you're guessing on things that you're going to guess that a metrical foot is an iamb. And metrics, scansion helps us to see where the poet's putting certain emphases. So prose chopped up into verses of alternately rhyming lines of an equal number of syllables is not poetry. Louis Zagosky was a great objectivist poet, very, very important in the early 20th century, and he set forward this idea about it, this idea concerning poetry not being like prose, that poetry had to be something different. There had to be a musical quality to the language, but it also was different than song lyrics. Like some song lyrics can rise to the level of poetry, but for the most part, song lyrics are not poetry. And why that is interesting to think about. A lot of it has to do with how language is being used, the artistry in actually using the language. So I'm going to pause here for a little bit, pause the video here, and maybe post some more tomorrow on this. But I want you to go and look at some of the Langston Hughes poems, or look at the poem I assigned you, and think about it and read it out loud and see what makes this a poem. Why isn't this a piece of prose? Why isn't it a short story or an essay?